speakers, Ambassador Bill Brownfield, Ambassador Arturo Suracan, to talk about the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drug Policy. I'll say a few words of opening remarks around where I think we are at this moment, and then we're going to turn to Ambassador Brownfield and followed by Ambassador Suracan to kick things off with their thoughts about what this particular moment means. I think this is a very good time to be thinking ahead. 2015 is a big year on development. We have the development financing meeting in July. We have the SDG summit in September, and at that summit there will be a new target under the health goal about prevention and treatment of substance abuse and including narcotic drug abuse. For the first time, this issue is getting put forward. Then we have the climate change meeting, the COP in Paris in December, and then we're looking forward into the spring of next year, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drug Policy. So I don't think it's too early to talk about this. This is an issue that has special resonance in the Americas. It's something that's getting an increasing amount of discussion in the May 2nd Economist, the New York Times, the New Yorker. Various other folks have come forward to begin talking about this, and we'll hear more today. I just want to start with a couple of key moments that I think show the shift or the ferment, the active ferment that's ongoing within the U.S. context around these issues. Last April 9th, President Obama was in Jamaica and had an extended conversation with a diverse audience of Jamaicans and had some fairly dramatic things to say on this subject that I think have turned out to be quite impactful on this question around drug control. He said, "I'm a very strong believer that the path that we have taken in the U.S., so-called war on drugs, has been so heavy in emphasizing incarceration that it has been counterproductive. You have young people who did not engage in violence, who get very long penalties, get placed in prison, and then are rendered economically unemployable, are almost pushed into then the underground economy, learn crime more effectively in prison, families are devastated." So calling for reform of criminal justice system, in commenting on legalizing marijuana and the actions undertaken by states in the United States, and there are several others that are now, there are 4 states, plus the District of Columbia, and we may see action in this next year by 2 others. The president went on in a very pragmatic way to emphasize respecting states' rights, and let's see what happens. Those states that have a strong enough public health infrastructure to push against the potential of increased addiction, then it's conceivable that that will spur on a national debate. And on the question of international policy, I also thought there was a real sense of realism and pragmatism here in saying, yes, we have serious enduring problems with very malevolent international crime syndicates carrying out drug actions. We need to have a more balanced approach, which was his appeal. We need to focus on a public health approach to decreasing demand. We need to strike the right balance. Following that, just recently in Vienna at the annual meetings on these issues, the White House, the lead White House personality on drug control, Mike Botticelli, introduced a resolution. Bill Brownfield was there, and part of that effort, a resolution put forward by the U.S. that called for reform across multiple levels in dealing with substance use disorders around the world, people who are serving extended prison sentences, not receiving adequate treatment and prevention, need to increase the use of alternatives to incarceration. And in that provision, I wanted to emphasize that that resolution drew support from the Americas, from Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and Uruguay, among a number of other countries. So there's a lot of thinking going on leading up to all of this, and it's also been emphasized recently that while there's a reform, a convergence of opinion and a ferment around this rebalancing and moving towards these measures, there's also the awareness that there are, in the words of The Economist, there are new drug warriors There's a new hardline approach that is coming from other places, some of it not so new when you're talking about Russia, but certainly the executions in Indonesia, actions in Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, which is a reminder that moving forward into some sort of consensus position in less than a year's time, from a diplomatic standpoint, is going to be very complex and difficult undertaking. So with those words of opening, I'd like to, first of all, thank Ambassador Brownfield and Sarikhan for coming and being with us. And I'd like to ask Ambassador Brownfield to open things up with a few moments of remarks on background on what we can expect, and then we'll move to Ambassador Sarikhan. Thank you.
Ambassador, do you notice he thanks us in advance, just in case you and I say things that are so stupid and foolish that he cannot thank us at the end. Dr. Morrison, Ambassador Shapiro, Ambassador Sarikhan, world affairsians, good afternoon, and it is in fact a pleasure to be with you here in Atlanta this afternoon. May I offer four words that are associated with this conference: Latin America, drugs, reform, health, and healthcare. Those are four themes that come together very nicely, and I urge everyone in this room to remember all four of these word groups, not just one or two. I also will note, Dr. M, in the interest of full disclosure, that I am responsible for international drug programs and policy and operations. I will leave the domestic issues to you. Having said that, I believe there is plenty of room for good conversation and good debate in terms of where we are globally on drug policy and drug reform. No less an authority than Dr. Morrison had just pointed out, than the President of the United States has said, this is a good debate. We welcome the debate. I would suggest as well that for the last 50 years or so of human history, the debate has been dominated almost completely by two extreme positions. At one extreme, those who say absolute prohibition is the only possible policy, and for anyone who violates the rules of absolute prohibition, the full power and majesty of the criminal justice system should be applied. At the other extreme are those who say, perhaps with equal simplisticness, are those who say, let us simply legalize everything and the entire problem will go away. Ladies and gentlemen, let me let you in on a little secret. Both extremes are in error. The solution, as always, must be found somewhere in between the two extremes. And there is, in fact, a lot of space to consider, contemplate, and eventually agree and implement reforms and changes. We're starting a 10-month preparation period for the first special session of the UN General Assembly in more than 10 years, dedicated to a review of global drug policy and possible drug reform. The meeting will occur in April of next year, and we already have several steps taken in terms of preparations. In September of last year, the OAS held in Guatemala City a conference to address for the entire hemisphere drug policy and drug reform. In March of this year, as Steve pointed out, the United Nations oversight body for drug policy, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, met in Vienna and addressed this issue and developed some new ideas. And finally, about three and a half weeks ago in New York, there was a special meeting of the United Nations General Assembly to address just this specific issue. Ladies and gents, let me suggest to you that if you believe it is complicated to reach agreement and consensus in the United States as to what our drug policy should be, please imagine multiplying that complication by a factor of 196. That is the number of separate, sovereign, and independent countries that are represented in the United Nations system. And imagine the difficulty of finding consensus among all of those nations and their governments in terms of what we should do and how we should proceed. Because if we don't have consensus, the policy will not work, at least as broadly as we would hope that it should work. We believe there are 4 basic principles that can give us the architecture within which we can, in fact, have a useful debate and a useful discussion and dialogue over the next year. First is to accept and respect the integrity of the 3 international drug control conventions that are currently in play in the United Nations. There is a 61 convention, a 72 convention, and a 1988 convention. I do not argue, ladies and gentlemen, that these are perfect in every way. I do argue that the likelihood of getting new conventions approved by 2/3 of the governments of planet Earth in the course of our lifetime or our great-grandchildren's lifetimes is very, very limited. Second, let us accept that within those 3 international conventions, there is a certain degree of flexibility. The conventions are not absolutely rigid and do allow individual states and individual governments to pursue policies that are somewhat different one from the other. Third, let us accept as a principle tolerance for differing national strategies by governments reflecting their own realities. In other words, one size does not fit all. China is different from Uruguay. Switzerland is different from Indonesia, and while we all must abide by our international treaty obligations, we have to accept that different governments will take different approaches. And finally, as the president said, and Steve so correctly quoted him, let us also agree that whatever our views may be on the matter of legalization or prohibition, we all agree to combat and resist large transnational criminal organizations who traffic in the product for economic gain using blood and violence as their business model. Anyone in this room who wishes to stand up and defend the rights of those organizations to engage in that sort of business can count on an argument from me. So where does this take us as we begin the process leading to the UN special session in April of next year? I would suggest 2 or 3 areas that Dr. Morrison has already mentioned. One, public health. The way the Director of National Drug Control, Michael Botticelli, has laid it out is to say this is not so much a matter of criminal justice science as it is a matter of neuroscience. Drug treatment, common curricula and common standards, rehabilitation, how to link together medical centers and medical approaches around the world. This is an area that should get a great deal of attention. Second, criminal justice reform. The President of the United States himself has said the current approach has produced some outcomes that were not what we were looking for and seeking. Are there alternatives to incarceration? Is there possibility for sentencing reform? Is there a role for drug courts, adjudication processes separate from the criminal justice system? These are areas that are worthy of and merit more conversation and more discussion. Third, greater cooperation on the drug issue, not just police and law enforcement, but the total package. How can we link up those 196 governments in a common purpose to greater effectiveness? And fourth, as you can well imagine, we will continue to nudge on the issue of combating and resisting the transnational criminal organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude and yield the floor by saying once again, this conversation is a good conversation because we are no longer trapped by those at the two extremes who are, in essence, shrilly shouting at one another, kind of shouting over the heads of the 80% of the human race who are found in between those two extreme positions. We, here today and over the next 10 months, have an opportunity to review and carve out space for serious, realistic, and authentic change in between those two extremes. Thank you very much, Dr. M. I relinquish the balance of my time to the distinguished Dr. Sadhu Khan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador Surakan, you've been a major career diplomat within Mexico, ambassador of the United States for 6 or 7 years, an observer, a very close observer of changes politically and societally within the Americas and the interface on these issues, these complicated issues between the U.S. perspective and others. How do you see this lead up to the UNGAS? And what's the potential that it presents? And what do you see as some of the dividing points going forward?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join you and to join two dear and esteemed colleagues that I've had the privilege of working with during my tenure as ambassador to the United States, Charles Shapiro and Bill Brownfield, with whom we discussed many of the issues that we're engaged in this conversation today. I can't resist, as you were giving back the remainder of your time on the panel, of what happened in the Wild West when a cattle rustler is taken out to the plaza to be hanged. And the sheriff says, well, you know, you're allowed to say whatever you want before you're hung. And he says, no, I'm not in the mood, you know, get over with this and please, you know, go on with the execution. And in the back of the plaza, a guy lifts his hand and says, would the right honorable gentleman yield the remainder of his time? And the guy who's going to be executed looks at the sheriff and says, I don't understand what he's saying. He says, well, look, this is a very pompous way. The gentleman is the representative of this county in Washington, and it's a very pompous way of saying that if you don't want to speak, will you allow him to speak and speak on your behalf and take up your time? And the guy sort of looks at the sheriff for a second, looks at this gentleman in the back and says, well, okay, but hang me first. So I hope we don't do that here today. Ambassador Brownfield has addressed many of the issues that I think we will be discussing, especially in terms of what we can and can't expect from UNGAS next year. It's going to be extremely complex because one of the issues that I think has changed fundamentally since the last time there was a special session in the UN General Assembly on drugs is that the traditional dynamics of what the drug trade and the drug consumption looked like worldwide has changed over the past decade and a half. I still remember the days you were talking about the debate, sort of the simplistic debate between legalization and prohibition. You remember very well, there was another sort of similar paradigmatic cleavage between those who argued that it was the demand that created the problem and those who would argue that it was the supply. And for many, many, many years, especially when we had the drug certification process, which we were able to get rid of in 2002, it was not strange for the United States to wag its finger at countries in Latin America and say, you know, you're the springboard of all the drugs coming into the United States. And Latin American countries, including my own, would conveniently, sometimes jingoistically, retort that if they were the swimming pool, if they were the springboard, the United States was the swimming pool. One of the things that has changed in the debate over illicit drugs is that the old paradigms of this is a transit country, this is a consumer country, and this is a producer country have dissipated. Most countries today produce, are transshipment points, and consume. Look at Mexico. Mexico traditionally had been a transshipment country. Yes, some level of black, low quality heroin, black tar would come into the US. Yes, a sizable chunk of marijuana came into the United States, but Mexico was mainly a transshipment point of drugs. Very low demand for drugs. Look at Mexico today. One of the reasons it explains how violence has erupted in Mexico over the past 10 years is not only how organized crime has morphed, but also the fact that they're now fighting for control of street corners and cities and towns in Mexico because consumption in Mexico has gone through the roof. Look at another regional powerhouse, Brazil. Brazil today, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of market worth, not per capita, but I think market worth, market value, is the largest consumer of cocaine in the Western Hemisphere. So the old paradigms with which we approached the illicit drug dynamics have changed. Moreover, that has triggered asymmetrical policies. And again, as Bill has correctly said, Uruguay is not the same as Mexico or as China. Things that can be done in countries like Portugal or the Netherlands or Uruguay cannot be done in other countries. You know, I remind people when they say, oh, look at what Uruguay did with legalization of cannabis. Uruguay has the total population of one of the boroughs of Mexico City. So the realm of the possible varies from country to country. So these two shifts, the distinction that is broken down between consumers and producers, and how asymmetrical the challenges and the approaches of nations that will be engaged in UNGAS will make this a very difficult process to achieve agreement and, more importantly, consensus. There's one final thing that I do have to put on the table, and even though Bill has very quickly sort of drawn the Rubicon or the line in the sand saying, you know, I do the international stuff, I don't deal with domestic policy.
Clever that, wasn't it?
Very clever. You have to understand, and again, taking this back to the conversation over Latin America and how Latin America is engaging in this debate and will position itself on the road to UNGAS next year. There is an issue of contradiction, if you like, between what the United States is doing domestically and what the United States still adheres to, even though there have been some, I may put him in trouble because the law of the land is still the law of the land, but there have been some important shifts in how the United States goes about interdiction and eradication policies. But there is a contradiction. You can't ask countries like Mexico or Colombia, or Canada for that matter, that is an important producer of marijuana, increasingly of precursor chemicals coming in to the Americas. You can't ask these countries to put their Churchillian quota of blood, sweat, and tears and resources to whack weeds and eradicate marijuana if you can legally produce it, buy it, and consume it in 4 states in the United States. There is a contradiction there. In many ways, this is what sort of explains the pushback that we've seen in the past couple of years. In many ways, it explains what I think is one of the most, I've always been an important and vocal critic of the OAS, of the Organization of American States, because I think it lacks heft and it does not have the teeth that it needs to engage in a roster of very important issues throughout the Americas. But the OAS has put forward a very compelling document that it published last year as to how the Americas need to start rethinking and revisiting the paradigms of how we confront consumption of illicit substances and develop a much more holistic approach to drugs and thugs in the Americas. One last word of caution, because I know that the idea is that we don't suck up all the oxygen and we have a discussion on specific issues of this very important debate. One thing that is also very important to understand, and as Bill, I think, very articulately stated, the whole debate over legalization, yes, in a perfect world, legalization would be the best way to go, but this ain't a perfect world, and there are no silver bullets or magic potions to confront especially what is the most important issue, at least in the Americas, underlying the challenge of confronting drug trafficking, which is the rule of law. Please do not think, and I have strenuous, let me say this for starters. I am one who believes that drug control policy is one of the greatest failures of social public policy this world has seen in the past 3 or 4 decades. B, and even though people attribute it to Einstein, apparently Einstein never said it, but you all know one of the definitions of madness, which is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. That's what we've been doing in drug control policy, international drug control policy, for the past 3 decades. Having 3, I support legalization as a public policy tool. Now, where we have to be extremely careful is when individuals in this country suggest, say, or stipulate that Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, and the District of Columbia, by doing what they've done, will help mitigate violence in Mexico. This is poppycock. And whoever thinks that legalization in the United States, per se, will end violence and criminality in Mexico is smoking too much of the stuff that we're seizing down there. Because the real challenge that countries like Mexico and Colombia and some of our Central American neighbors are facing today isn't the challenge of violent organized criminals dealing in drugs per se. It's the lack of an effective rule of law. And the only thing that will happen, let's say tomorrow the United States magically legalizes marijuana throughout the nation, and this becomes a federal policy. The impact of that on the Mexican side of the border can be extremely complex, because given Mexico's inefficient and weak rule of law, the only thing that's going to happen is that organized crime is like any business. It's like Coca-Cola in Atlanta. Don't get worried. I'm not going to go anywhere close to suggesting anything like that. But what does Coca-Cola do, or companies like Coca-Cola? You buy and acquire and you merge, or you even get involved in hostile takeovers and acquisitions. At the end of the day, organized crime is like a business. They do 2 things: hostile takeovers and mergers and acquisitions. If they can't make the money that they make today from drugs coming into the United States, they will bleed into other illicit activities because the rule of law is weak. And unless you address and strengthen the rule of law in countries like Mexico, policies like legalization may impact on the margins, but won't structurally change the dynamics of crime, of violence, and of human security. So this is why, as we discuss legalization, we have to understand that in countries throughout the Americas, if legalization is to succeed and if legalization moves forward, it has to occur in tandem with a fundamental revamping of our justice systems, or if not, it will fail. Having said this, I think that we are at a very adequate moment to trigger, hopefully, what is a outside of the box, blue sky thinking process as we head to the young us in April next year. What I do think is that public opinion in Latin America is turning, and it will be increasingly hard to convince societies and public opinions that the old paradigms and the tactics that have been pursued so far can continue to be applied by governments in the region. And this, I think, will be one of the very important undertones of the discussion that we see in the coming weeks and months as we head to New York and August next year.
Thank you so much. Thank both of you. It's quite striking how, in a way, how much there is an opening of discussion around these issues. You've got, as Ambassador Brownfield emphasized, you've got a new consensus emerging around public health and the science around public health and trying to move towards standard treatments and prevention and moving that agenda forward. Criminal justice reform, there's an emerging consensus around that as an area where much more progress can be made. On the legalization issues, it seems to me that is something that tests all of us, and we're not really sure within the United States, of the 4 states plus the District of Columbia, what happens and what's the momentum, and when it gets to a test of vote in California and Massachusetts, what happens and where does it go forward from there? But it certainly strains the bigger picture of our relationship with the Americas and beyond on the bigger issues. And I also sense that you're looking, both of you are looking hopefully, with hope, at the UNGAS next year, that you see this as a timely opportunity to come forward with an informed and civil and realistic discussion around what is the next 15 or 20 years going to look like. I mean, it seems to me that you're both suggesting that the complexities have gotten even worse. The criminal marketplace remains as virulent and powerful and more complex than it was earlier. Bill, what do you see as the best outcomes we can expect from next spring, from April?
Yep. Remember, I'm approaching this, and by the way, when I say I prefer not to enter into the domestic policy debate, it's not because I don't have thoughts and ideas and opinions, I do, but rather because it's inappropriate for me from this position to take a position on matters that involve domestic politics and decisions eventually to be made by the federal government of the United States of America. I am the international vicar, if you will, of U.S. policy in this regard. And I got to tell you, Steve, my coming in position is something that we perhaps have lost some sight of in the United States and political debate in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years. And that is the politics of the realistic, how to actually figure a way to get to an outcome that does not reflect whatever the complete position is that you hold. When I was growing up and learning my lessons in grade school and high school, we called it the art of compromise. And your starting position is you have an international community that covers the spectrum, ladies and gents, from some countries that are still executing people for nothing more than drug-related crimes. Now, pretty severe crimes. I mean, it's actually the traffickers and not, for the most part, just the consumers, but nevertheless, they would not necessarily have done any murder or other mayhem or harm, and they are being executed. And you run through this continuum to other countries that, to a very considerable extent, have legalized a tremendous percentage of the drug trafficking industry. Now, how do you find themes? How do you find, technical term, things that countries that are that broadly split can come to agreement on? And that's where I come up with, let's find some practical, pragmatic, and to some extent moderate issues. If we're not going to get everything that some might want with a single bite the first time you sit down at the table in April of 2016, can we at least get some bites that move you in the direction you want to go in, but do not frighten or turn off those states at either end of the spectrum? And And you've hit the target, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of what we should be looking at. We should be looking at public health and what more can we as an international community do to deal with the health consequences and realities of these products. We should be looking, in our opinion, at realistic criminal justice reform. Now, legalization is the ultimate, I guess, but I think there is absolutely no chance whatsoever. I mean, Dr. Sadhukan saw little chance. I see zero in April of 2016 that all the nations of Earth, or even 2/3, or even a simple majority, are going to rally around this particular concept. So what can we do in criminal justice reform issues that, in fact, all, or at least an overwhelming majority of countries of the planet could agree to and work with? Are there other things we can do in terms of dealing with the drug issue, whether it is education, social policy, supply and alternative development, provide stakeholders with a stake in the outcome of this? These are areas that those who come from either extreme will say, this is hardly enough, this is hardly adequate. But my own view is, fellas, if we are at least moving in a direction that a majority think is the right direction, we're getting there. You've got to crawl before you walk. You've got to walk before you run. Don't ask me to go from a standing start to a full sprint with no space in the middle.
But there's also, I think, I concur. I hope I didn't suggest that UNGUS could see a movement towards this position.
You didn't, Arturo. I'm from Texas.
I don't think that'll happen. I don't think that's in the cards. But what I would hope that we can nudge, and that UNGUS can be the place to do so, or the road to UNGUS, is that some of the pivots of what international drug control policy has been for the past 20 years are modified. Eradication. You can't put in place crop substitution policies unless you have those policies. You can't tell people, oh, we're gonna eradicate whatever you're growing, because then you'll be able to grow X, Y, and Z, unless those policies are already in place and are viable, and they have access to market, and they have investment, and they have access to capital. There is, I think, a growing consensus that more needs to be put into harm reduction, that more needs to be put into combating the most violent of the criminal organizations dealing in illicit narcotics. There are some things that can be shifted and changed in terms of what the predicates of how we've confronted illicit drugs in those international conventions have looked like. There may be even an option to have an opt-out number of policies and issues that some countries that, for whatever domestic reason, feel that they do not want, cannot afford to do some of those things that are being discussed, can opt out of those policy shifts and changes. But what can't happen is we can't leave UNGUS saying we have again missed an opportunity to modify the paradigms. I think then the danger is that you will have countries that will start doing stuff on their own, which may be good, but in terms of the regional connections and given what we've seen in these past years as to how the illicit business is fully interconnected, especially throughout the Americas, and now having some very important impact in other parts of the world as cocaine patterns of consumption in the United States have diminished. No surprise. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that we've been playing whack-a-mole for all these years. And if, for whatever reason, socio-demographic, cultural, the US has ceased to consume cocaine at the levels that it used to a decade ago, it's going out to Western Europe, it's going out to Asia. The problem is, it's going through Western Africa. And we know that one of the challenges that we have today in Western Africa is that we have two militant terrorist groups operating in Western Africa that are siphoning money off the proceeds from drugs going into the consumer market in Europe. So the danger of reaching a same old result in UNGUS next year is that it could lead countries to say, I'm going to do whatever I need to do, that could have an impact in terms of international cooperation and some of the policies that we, for example, Mexico and the United States, have so successfully put in place in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of how we understand and how we, the lessons, bad and good lessons that we've learned as to how you take on transnational organized crime. That some of that could have some very challenging impact for how the world community faces some of the collateral effects of organized crime.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear coming out of this is some of the positive forward-leaning changes that might be ratified, confirmed, elaborated next April. The emphasis on rule of law and investing in strengthening rule of law. A greater investment in collaboration internationally on public health, on harm reduction, treatment standards, safe opioid access, and on several other things. The criminal justice reform, but also an issue that we haven't talked much about, which is how do you contain or push back on the drug warriors that are becoming more prominent in other places, right? I mean, we didn't really face this issue of the new generation of drug warriors that are taking very hard lines. And we've seen with the Indonesian case, international attention from NGOs, from governments, from international organizations did very little to deter those actions. And we know that there are several very powerful states that really are not buying into the consensus that we're talking about here, which cuts across the Americas and thinking. So I would put that down along with your point around changing the outlook about the evolving nature of the transnational drug networks and the threats that may pose in terms of security, and what more might be done on that, particularly with respect to counterterrorism.
And one of the things that I would hope to see is what I think is probably on the law enforcement side of the equation, what is probably the best tool, a tool that has been shown by the United States post 9/11 to be able to deliver the goods, which is money laundering and going after the money. Because if more of our law enforcement resources can be put into money laundering instead of go fast boats and aircraft and helicopters and the fancy trinkets and toys that certain agencies in Washington love, and put more resources, manpower, and capabilities into interdicting the money flows, as the United States has so successfully done in terms of terrorist organizations post 9/11, the bang for the buck there is much higher. And it will, once you defang, we all know that if you take out a drug capo, there will be 7 people behind him lining up to take his or her place. We know that the drug kingpin decapitation strategy may not be the best strategy, but one thing that we do know is that if you take the money out of the equation, then you're neutralizing the ability of these groups to corrupt, to bribe, to buy new equipment. They're much more nimble and they're much more faster than governments are. I would always joke that when I was in government and having Bill in government.
What's it like outside of government, Arturo?
I can say more things than I used to. We have to deal with Congress, we have to deal with the media, we have to deal with interagency processes. Organized crime doesn't. If they need to buy a certain type of equipment to neutralize whatever Bill and his guys are doing out on the field, they go and do it. They don't need a committee, they don't need congressional approval, and they don't need to validate it in front of any public opinion. So we have to learn to use the tools that we have, which have proven to be successful in other fields. And again, here is where money laundering, I think, really has to achieve a much higher role and profile and muscularity in the US bureaucracy, not only to confront terrorism, as the US government has done so successfully, but to confront organized crime, where you still have a lot of bureaucratic pushback as to, well, no, we like to buy helicopters and ships and trinkets and toys.
Bill? 2 observations, one on what you just said, Steve, and one on what Arturo has just said. You note kind of the additional problem set of what to do with the outliers. May I, in terms of a reform of global drug policy and strategy, may I suggest, and I want to make this quite clear to everyone in this room, we're talking about China, India, Russia, Indonesia, Pakistan, at least as 5 right there. What do they represent in and of themselves 50% of the population of the human race. Ladies and gents, these aren't outliers. We're dealing with a big chunk of the human race and their governments. And we have to figure how to deal with that reality. You may like it or dislike it, agree with them or disagree with them, but you cannot ignore what constitutes half, and when you throw in the others, which are much smaller in terms of numbers and size, you're probably talking about more than half of the population of planet Earth, particularly if you throw in the United States of America. Arturo's point, in which I am in complete agreement, by the way, more focus, more attention, using lessons learned in terms of how to attack the financial structure and infrastructure by which large transnational multi-billion-dollar criminal organizations operate, because they operate for a reason. It is not the altruistic desire to bring the benefits of illicit drugs to the human race. It is to make money, and when you separate them from their money, you have a direct and immediate impact on them. We have learned lessons. I would add, by the way, Arturo, we've learned lessons as well in the counter-narcotics field in terms of dealing with money laundering. We have learned other lessons in terms of corruption as a policy that can, for the most part, get countries to unite around, so long as it doesn't go to the heart of their own systems. The only observation that I would make is that I believe we have learned over the last 40 years, and learned correctly in the counter-narcotics, anti-drug business, that to have an impact, you must in some way address all aspects of the problem. We have tried in the past to take just one issue, one link out of the chain. Once we brilliantly concluded in the 1970s that we would address cultivation by intense eradication. Once they're no longer growing the stuff, the problem disappears. Didn't work so well. Then we decided in the 1980s, let us address interdiction, heavily focused on the Caribbean. If we can stop them from moving product to market in North America, the problem will go away. What did they do? As Arturo has correctly pointed out, they moved to new networks and distribution routes. You can't solve the problem just by attacking one link of the chain, but you can reprioritize. You can surge efforts in one direction so long as you don't completely walk away from others.
Arturo, can you talk a bit about within Latin American and Caribbean societies, to what degree are the violent consequences of the drug war seen now and understood now as a health consequence?
I think increasingly most countries throughout the Americas understand, or are starting to understand, that at the end of the day, the issue of illicit drugs, besides being a rule of law challenge, is a public health issue. Mm-hmm. And that's where you've seen, I think, some interesting developments in terms of trying to craft holistic policies where you're not only trying to do harm reduction, but you're trying to change everything from laws decriminalizing personal possession, personal use of substances, like what the Mexican Congress did 6 or 7 years ago. Obviously, the most compelling example today is Uruguay. So I think that has started to change. I think the use of concepts and how we talk about this has also started to change throughout the region. One of the things that I continue, at least in the case of Mexico, because I think it's relevant there, is to push back on language that we've inherited. And I'm not this isn't a linguistics battle that I'm waging. It's really because if you get your points of reference wrong, the most likely thing is that your public policies will be the wrong ones. Mm-hmm. And when people talk about, especially the media, talk about cartels in Mexico, I say, wait a second. I wish they were cartels. What do cartels do? A cartel colludes to fix price and control supply. If the Mexican drug syndicates were doing that, it's very likely that the level of gang-on-gang violence that we've seen in Mexico over the past 8-10 years would not be at these levels. So the last thing the Mexican drug syndicates are today are cartels. They're not behaving like cartels. I give you this example because I think part of the challenge too, and as we head to UNGA, is how do we jettison concepts and language that were probably valid and reflected the dynamics and the values of 20 years ago, but which have fundamentally changed, not only in terms of the roster of public policies, the toolbox that we have at our disposal today, but also societal and public opinion values that have also changed over the past 10 years. Who would have said, even, I remember when I arrived in Washington in January of 2007, and you know, this whole thing of medical marijuana was there, but if those of us, Charles and Bill and myself and others, would have sort of thought that in 5-6 years we would have 4 states in the United States that had fully legalized the use of cannabis, we would have been taken for madmen. And you know, just wait until California does it and it's going to become a wildfire throughout the United States. So one of the things that we have to do is to understand that over time, concepts, values, and the way we approach some of these discussions have changed fundamentally, and that some of what we will see in UNGAS 2 also entails modifying language and concepts that were valid the last time we cobbled a convention together, and which would be utterly useless today if we were to reach some form of new document to come out of UNGAS next year.
I mean, I'm just struck, you know, as somebody who works on U.S. global health approaches, seldom do these issues surface in most discussions around U.S. global health approaches. Yet, when you go and look at the president's statement in Jamaica, look at some of Ambassador Brownfield's statements, look at Mike Botticelli's statements, there's a heavy emphasis on fairly specific things that should emerge as priorities in the field of public health in new kinds of collaborations and partnerships. I mean, there's really an implicit call to do more heading into the UN General Assembly special session. That hasn't translated into any kind of initiative or strong unified statement, but it's reflective, I think, of the sea changes that have happened within our own society, awareness of the critiques that have happened around the war on drugs that have come globally, and a search for new ways to move forward. It's just very striking to read these statements and go back and see how much it has come together in the last few years. Why don't we take some comments and some questions from you? We have about another 15 minutes. And we've got a microphone right here, and we've got one here. Please identify yourself, be very succinct, and put forward a single question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Altamirano, medical epidemiologist with CDC.
Also, please speak slowly because there's a lot of echo.
There's a lot of
echo
here, so
we're hearing your voice 3 times, and it's difficult.
And we're hearing ours 4 times, so.
Yeah. Following the same simple economical model that is production to meet demand, we can fight as much as we want to try to stop production or transportation to reach the American market. As far as there is the demand, they will keep finding different ways to reach the point of demand. Even if we stop one drug or one type of drug, they will create new drugs and they will create new avenues to reach the demand. Therefore, we cannot divorce what is going on at the international level with the domestic policies, and we cannot divorce the demand with what is going on the drug coming in. My question is, at which point, or what is more convenient, to fight the outside end of the chain, or to improve or address the factors conducting to the use of drugs in our youth or in our population. If we're going to shift towards reducing the demand, automatically they will find limited their market. For example, the simple law...
Let's draw it to a conclusion, please.
No, it's just an example of the same question. The simple law of legalization, let's find out what it will produce. Increase of use, or you think that it will decrease the use?
Arturo. Thank you.
I have a problem with the way you framed the question, because I think it reflects part of what continues to be wrong in the way we understand the problem. Sort of the question of what's better, impacting demand or attacking supply, and what's more cost effective. I think it's a mistake. Again, because if all the United States' neighbors were like Canada, then maybe I'd say certainly the way to do so is to focus on demand, bring demand down, and that'll solve the problem. The problem is that most of the countries around the world, especially in the neighborhood of the Americas, aren't Canada. And again, to my concern, if you, let's assume, you solve the issue of demand, you stigmatize, let's assume that you're in favor of not legalizing, and you stigmatize the use of drugs like this country has stigmatized the use of cigarette smoking, and you completely change the patterns of demand in the United States. Will that solve the problems of illicit production, of criminality in the rest of the Americas? No, because the problems there, yes, have to do with how demand drives production, but have to do with other issues, again, as I mentioned, like rule of law. I would probably put it this way. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that as long as the demand for drugs is completely inelastic and the supply for drugs is completely elastic, by emphasizing resources on the supply side, the only thing you're doing is adding incentives for new bad actors to come into the equation. Why? Because the revenue is made in the transshipment points of the drugs coming into the United States. So if you were to reframe your question as to where do we get the biggest bang from the buck in the chain that goes from production to distribution to consumption, I would definitely say I think we get a much higher bang if we seize what's the ton what's a kilo of cocaine in New York go for? $25,000 now?
Actually, it's closer to 50, yeah.
50,000. Sort of where, again, going back to the money laundering and taking the money out of the equation. What is much more effective? Interdicting or seizing a kilo of cocaine in New York City that goes for $56,000, that goes to the drug traffickers or the criminal organizations, or seizing whatever is the equivalent of that kilo in coca leaves, which probably costs about $100 in Colombia or in Peru. So those are some of the discussions that I think we have to think of as we try and get a handle on what type of public policies related to law enforcement are more effective.
I'll add one quick comment to that as well, Steve. I have often heard, rarely a day goes by, where I do not hear a critique that in essence goes like this. We have been trying our current drug control policies for more than 50 years. They have not worked. It is a failure. Therefore, we should jettison it. Now, while I understand that reasoning process, I would suggest to you that we have not successfully eliminated murder from the planet. And yet no one argues that we should jettison our policies that prohibit and criminalize murder. My point is, perhaps rather than looking at assessing the tactics that have been used, it would be more helpful to go to the fundamental issue, which in my opinion, and you all may have your own opinions on this, is that the product that we are trying to address is inherently harmful to humans and to societies. And the fundamental question then is, what do we as a society, as a community, as a government, and as a community of government want to do about this? And there's plenty of room for us to argue on this particular point. In my opinion, it is how do we address with the fact that the substance is toxic and addictive and therefore inherently harmful, how do we try to address and control that? And maybe at the end of the day, it is closer to our approach to alcohol or tobacco. Maybe it is closer to our approach to murder. But from my perspective, that is the useful conversation to have, rather than to continue to recycle the it's evil, it's harmful, you should go to jail for just thinking about it. That's the prohibitionist. Or it's been a complete and utter failure, let's just legalize it. That's the legalizers. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Pat McMahon. I'm a member of the World Affairs Council. I recently heard a comment on a TV show that surprised me, excuse me, after almost 40 years on the front line of the drug war. The commentator stated that the drug war was a major contributor and factor to the deterioration of black society. And I'd like to hear your comments on that, whether you agree or disagree. I can give some background on that.
To what society?
To what society?
The black society, the black community in the U.S. And what he was saying was the young kids mostly leave high school before the 10th grade, or they get out of high school, and they see these drug dealers on the street making a lot of money. By the way, a kilo of cocaine in the Atlanta area is $2,000 to $4,000. I understand why it goes to New York now. And they don't have a job and they don't have any future because they have no education and there are no job opportunities. So they go to what they see their friends doing, making lots of money. And he said that's one of the major factors that's driving them into the drug war and ends up in prison.
I bet you're going to throw this one to me, aren't you, Arturo? By the way, my New York assessment is based not upon what you would get for a bulk kilo, but rather if you take 1,000 1-gram lines,
retail,
what you would end up paying
retail.
for. At literally retail at street level. Listen, you pulled me into a domestic area, but I am not an idiot, despite what you may have heard from my wife over the last 30 years. I've had many conversations with political leaders who are responsible for the leadership of large urban communities or for the policing in those large urban communities. I will not identify them because they are private conversations. It should not surprise you that I had some of those conversations this very morning. And I will tell you that they do address drugs as part of a package of complicated issues. It's not just drugs, though. It's economy and jobs, it's education, it's social fabric, it's families and maintenance of the family structure, and drugs as being part of that issue. I will tell you that depending upon where you sit, has a substantial impact in terms of what your position will be. And I will tell you, because I think he has said this publicly, and I will name one human being who has, over the last 20 years of my engagement and my contact with him, perhaps been the strongest proponent of a strong drug control policy in the United States Congress. His name is Charlie Rangel, and his district is Harlem in the city of New York. And he has said privately and publicly, look at my district. Don't ask me to support a policy or a program that is going to make it easier rather than harder to acquire and use this sort of product. I don't say he's right. I don't say he's wrong. I do say this is part of the debate that we should be having in this country. And I would go so far as to say, as the president has implied, in fact, I think once actually said, to a certain extent, we have some experiments going on. We call those experiments Washington State and Colorado, and more recently, Oregon and Alaska. And as the president has suggested, let's see what happens there. Are there going to be more emergency room cases or fewer? Are there going to be more drugged driving accidents or not? Are we going to find greater consumption by children and minors or not? Are we going to see the same, more, less criminal involvement in the process? I don't know. I do say it behooves us to monitor and track the statistics and incorporate them into our own internal domestic debate.
I think it's important to add that part of what's triggered, I think, the reform for criminal justice is the sense, and the president himself has said this in one of his interviews recently, the sense of social injustice, that there's disproportional racial composition within prisons of low-level offenders, and this is a reality. This is something that people have struggled with, and this is something that's getting concentrated action under this administration right now, with strong bipartisan support and support from the faith community as well. And this is a long overdue and very promising dimension of trying to address the racial impact, the differential, asymmetrical racial impact of drugs. And so that's very real. Let's get our final two questions and comments. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Arlana Henry. I'm a graduate student at the University of Georgia. You mentioned decriminalizing the use of substances, and so I was interested if I wanted you guys to speak on mental illness and the interconnectedness between mental illness, public health, and deviance and crime, because it's often something that we don't talk about when we look at drug use, particularly like on a global and domestic level. Can you just
slow down a bit, because we've got so much echo in this room.
We're hearing you 3 times. Every time you say something, we hear it 3 times.
I know you're speaking normally, but we're hearing it.
Yeah, and I speak really fast because sometimes I get nervous. I wanted you guys to speak about mental illness as it pertains to drug use and its relationship to deviance and crime. That's the simplest way to put it.
Okay. And why don't we take your comment or question also, and then we can come back, and then we can close. Yes. That not working? Okay.
Hi, Mo Richards with Richards Consulting International Policy. My question regards the larger idea of international policy as it relates to the work that you do. We are just concluding the Millennium Development Goals. How have those impacted the work that you have been doing? Because listening to the presentation, it sounds as if as we have worked towards accomplishing the goals, there has been an increase in the deviance or the establishment of the drug world, if I could put it that way.
Thank you. So we have a question around the the MDG impact and looking forward to the SDGs. Then we have a question around mental health and the interconnection.
If I understood the last question correctly, I would have very little to add to the mental health question, except that I'm your garden variety lunatic. So, but on the issue of the Millennium Goals and how those have advanced, whereas some of the if I understood the question correctly, was whereas we've had some important traction in some of the Millennium Goals, this issue of international drug control policy seems to be stuck. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I would sign that. I think that's the case, and I think that's why UNGUS next year is going to be so important. I think we've got a subset of 2 challenges which make UNGUS a complex endeavor. On the one hand, the issue that we've already addressed, which is how today there's a cleavage between countries that are willing to have this type of conversation and to experiment and to do what the US federal government is doing and allowing the states to sort of figure out how these policies might work before sort of attempting to say, okay, this is going to be the federal policy of the United States, or other countries like Uruguay or Portugal or others that are sort of tinkering with ways in how to confront this. With this block of nations, which not only are opposed to focuses like these, but are at the same time challenging the rules-based international system of the 21st century, because they feel that it was written when they were weak, because they feel that it was written by the United States at the moment of its, as the French called it, American hyperpuissance, the superpower, the sole hegemon after the end of the Cold War. They feel that these rules that have developed coincidentally over the past decade weren't written by them. They did not partake in the conversations. And so, no surprise, they feel that given that they weren't at the table, they're on the menu. They as countries are on the menu. So you've got this double conundrum of countries that not only don't agree with some of the approaches that countries like the US and Uruguay and others have taken, but they feel that it is part of the Western or US-dominated system of values that they don't adhere to. And then the second challenge, obviously, is that the last time that we were battling away on these issues, the US was dramatically, the US would have been where China and India and others are today. The US has advanced dramatically, whether it's done so haphazardly, whether it's done so at the local and state level more than at the federal level. We can have that discussion. But certainly where the US is today, where China and India and others are today, is where the US was the last time we were headed to the UN to discuss the international conventions. So that's also used by some of these countries to say, okay, you've changed. Why are you forcing us into debate that for domestic, social, value reasons we don't adhere to? So that, I think, is in these two dynamics are, I think, what in part explains why it has been so difficult to see the type of traction that we've seen in the discussion and advancement of some of the other Millennium Goals and the discussion over illicit drug use and drug trafficking worldwide at the same time.
And let me loop back and offer a quick comment on the mental illness and mental health issue as well. Because I was the one who brought it up in terms of explaining the importance of public health as an element of a drug reform process leading to the UNGAS in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not mean to suggest that anyone who abuses drugs, alcohol, tobacco, eats fatty foods, does not get enough exercise, or any of the other, doesn't use a seatbelt or doesn't wear a helmet while riding a motorcycle is mentally ill. These are separate issues between clinical mental illness and, in a sense, voluntary decisions and choices that are made that we as a society have concluded we either must protect individuals from for their own good, or we as a society have said we are not prepared to pay for the consequences of these decisions, whether it's tremendous cost for hospitalization, whether it is the phenomenal healthcare costs of individuals who are in a condition at age 50 that you would not expect them to be at age 80, whatever. Society has determined that it can make these sorts of decisions. It is a matter of neuroscience. It is not necessarily a matter of mental illness. That said, when you combine genuine mental illness with drug abuse, you have a tragedy that is multiplied by a factor of 5 or 10. We do need to address that issue in some way that is both respectful of the victim, and this is an area where the word victim is the only possible word you can use, and in a sense, our own policies as to what should be the global policy in terms of all of society. I would add one additional developmental point to what Arturo said. He was talking about some of the complications on how to deal with development as it relates to drugs, drug reform, drug policy, drug control. I would add the domestic political side as well. There are few humans on this planet who would disagree with the statement that by providing economic and social development and developmental options, we make it easier for the poor campesino or subsistence farmer not to grow opium poppy or coca. Duh. It is, however, extremely difficult to win the political argument in national legislatures as to why they should pay for this sort of economic assistance when we've got enough problems here at home. Our own economy is not doing exceptionally well. Why are we supposed to shell out hundreds of millions of dollars to pay farmers in other countries? Why don't we pay them to our farmers here? It's a complicated political argument. I get it. Ambassador Sarukhan gets it. Everyone in this room gets it. But when you put it into the political pressure cooker, it becomes more complicated.
Thank you. We've gotten to the end of the hour. This has been an exceptionally rich conversation. I do want to remind people that the Sustainable Development Goals that will be put forward in September for debate and ratification do include, and under the chronic diseases, mental health is included. And now there is a special target under health as well on, as I mentioned, prevention and treatment of substance abuse, including narcotic drug abuse and harmful use of alcohol. So we're going to have indicators that track these progress. It's going to legitimize and elevate and put a new light on those issues and hopefully make it easier to begin doing programmatic work and policy work collaboratively in these areas going into the future. To both of you, thank you so much for this very dynamic and rich exploration of what we're going to see potentially next April and in the lead up to that time. So please join me in thanking our two distinguished speakers.
I'm Cedric Sussman, and I'm Director of Programming for the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and have the privilege of ending and moderating this final panel. And what we'd like to do is...
I was just suggesting maybe get the people who are outside in the hall, let them know that the session is starting.
Right, thank you. Okay. What we want to do is do a quick wrap-up from each of our leaders in this collaborative effort. As I said, this is the 4th year that we've been together, and it's been a really quite remarkable collaboration between the Council, CARE, and CSIS. I'm going to start with you, Helene, if I may, because it struck me that we have not talked much about development per se, and certainly not about women's empowerment, which is a major focus of your own efforts over the last few years. Given that, what kind of takeaway do you have from what you've heard today, and how it might relate to those issues?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cedric. And you know, again, thanks to the audience for hanging in there. This, for me, has been a really wonderful convening, and I take away a lot. But let me just focus on what you were alluding to. And as I think most people know, CARE is not a health organization, even though it has the name CARE, and I'm a physician, and oftentimes people think that it is a health care organization, but it is a development organization, and our focus is on eliminating extreme poverty around the world. Health is part of that, but you know, we focus on education, economic development, et cetera, and one of the cornerstones of our work is empowering girls and women, because we know that that girls and women disproportionately make up the poor, but also that if you change the life of girls and women, you have a kind of a catalytic effect on change within communities. And I can go on that, but you know, when I think about this session, the issue of women didn't come up explicitly, except if you want to think about some of the discussions around cervical cancer. But implicit in a lot of the things that people talked about, I think really the issue of women's roles were very much part of that. So, you know, when I think about Frank Richards and his discussion around social injustice and inequity issues, you know, part of why we focus so much on girls and women is that it is one of the clearest senses, one of the clearest examples of injustice around the world and inequity. And so addressing the issue of women and women's inequality is important for health. We also know that throughout the world, women are the caretakers. Women are often the ones who are more likely to have an influence on behaviors, nutrition within the home, the sorts of things that lead to a lot of the chronic diseases that we talked about. So, I think it's hard to not think about these issues around health and realize that behind a lot of the things that we've talked about, the role of women is so clearly important in this. And I'm glad you brought it up, because many times throughout the morning and the afternoon, I've thought to myself, it's amazing that we haven't more explicitly talked about how important the role of women is for all of the kinds of things that we've talked about. So,
I mean, specifically in terms of delivery of health care to the family, it seems to me that there must be some modality that could be put in place to improve.
Well, definitely.
access.
I mean, women are not only the caretakers in the home, which I think has a huge impact on caregiving broadly. But if you think about frontline healthcare workers, they are often nurse midwives or community nurse assistants, et cetera, that are women. So I think a lot of what we talk about when we think about building community health systems, when we talk about looking at primary care systems, the outreach that many people talked about, a lot of that is really looking at how we're building women's capacity to be able to provide those kinds of services.
Good. Steve, CSIS is essentially has a focus on policy, but you also deal really in depth with a lot of the medical issues around the topics that we've talked about today. But what are your takeaways in terms of action, and particularly through implementation of better health delivery? Are there action steps that you heard or feel should be followed up on?
Well, there are a couple of major impressions from the discussions. Tom Frieden talked about health security. We talked about it last night also when President Moreno from the Inter-American Development Bank was there. These issues are very relevant, although they may not be front and center, because the shocks that have been experienced of late were West Africa concentrated with the Ebola case. But it's not that far back in the past where Mexico was experiencing shocks, Haiti was experiencing shocks, and I think the global health security agenda that Tom's been involved in driving forward remains very relevant to the Americas, and perhaps that is something that we'll see more of. I mean, Tom talked about Peru being one of the first countries to volunteer for an assessment. So the health security agenda, very relevant, very live. The actual shock, its shock factor, less immediately powerful at the moment. On the drugs issue, what we just finished talking about, I do think that the public health agenda around harm reduction, around opioid access, safe opioid access, over treatment standards, some very concrete things that are coming to the fore as requiring technical expertise, collaborations, best practices, investments, and the like. That's an agenda that is a shared agenda and is one which offers some opportunities. We know we have a certain amount of expertise in these areas, as do many of the Latin partners, and I think much more can be done there. The third point I want to make is around Cuba. We didn't have a chance today to talk about it as a dedicated subject, but it's surfaced in a couple of different ways. The point has been made that the Inter-American Development Bank is prevented from moving forward in engagement on modernizing and upgrading the health sector in Cuba until the U.S. position changes. We've heard that there's a special history in terms of its normative emphasis on bedside manner, health diplomacy, using this as a tool internationally. We also know that this is a country where at the secondary and tertiary level, it's woeful, and there's going to be a transformation in bringing care within Cuba in the future. And the question is how to make that as equitable and affordable and high quality going forward. And the U.S. needs to get engaged early, not late. It needs to be both on the private sector and public sector. So this moment is fast upon us. I know that Charles is leading a delegation there. Some of the people here are joining that, and I think that's terrific. And I guess I would just call, Charles, that after your delegation, to the degree we might be able to reconvene to think about Cuba and about what does this mean, we would certainly welcome that opportunity, because I think you're going to come back with some dramatic insights. And I do believe we need to push in order to create greater expectations that the U.S. should be leaning forward with the Cubans on the health sector as a lead sector to bring about the normalization of relations. Thank you.
Good. So Charles, as the diplomat and as the Foreign Service person, and you've represented our country for many years, how do you see what you've heard relating to U.S. relationships with these countries, but also in the end, healthcare is an in-country issue. Yeah, and the governance of Latin American and Caribbean countries is so tenuous at times. How do you see this being strengthened?
I'd actually look at it a little bit differently. That's one of the things I've written here is sovereignty is the key issue. And we're talking about 34 sovereign nations, from Brazil with 200 million people to some of the independent Caribbean islands with under 100,000 population. And it's great to get experts in the room who know what ought to be done. But the key thing about sovereignty is you get to decide for yourself what you're going to do with your country, whether it's on drug policy or it's on health policy, whether it's on non-communicable diseases or access to health care. And that's what politics are about. That's what international diplomacy is about, is how do you create the political will in other countries to do the things that experts like we've heard today think might be good for them. And experts, as we all know, aren't necessarily right in all cases. So, I mean, those are sovereign decisions for 34 nations to make. Imagine the challenge of getting, what was it Brownfield said, 196 countries together at the special session on drugs next April to reevaluate drug policy. I mean, that's a Herculean task. So, I mean, that's what I see. On Cuba, just a bit of self-serving advertising is on June 9th, we're going to have a discussion about Cuba at the World Affairs Council. It's a members-only members forum. And I encourage all of you who are members to please come. That's Tuesday a week, as we say in Georgia.
Or all of you who aren't members,
to join. That was my next line, but now I don't need to say it. Thank you if you're not. Anyway, we've got your email addresses, and we're going to track you down. Expect y'all all to join and to be there next Tuesday, because we're going to have a fascinating discussion about Cuba and the United States. And I assure you that among those of us who've already been to Cuba and those who are going to Cuba and those who are experts on Cuba, there is no consensus. And to go back to the sovereignty issue, we may think we know what the government of Cuba ought to do, but it is the government of Cuba in the end of the day that is going to decide what it is going to do. And I don't know anybody outside of Cuba who has any influence on that government.
Before I ask one more question, please do come up to the microphone and we'll open it to questions from the floor. But my last question actually relates to the issue of sovereignty, but more directly to the role of PAHO, Pan American Health Organization. We've referenced it during the course of the program, but we didn't have a direct representative talking about their role. Can they, in a sense, pull together some cohesion, particularly in the Caribbean region, which is so diverse, and we've often talked about that problem, particularly in other areas like power generation. But within the health area, What is the role of PAHO, do you?
I think it's important to emphasize, Cedric, that we were very assiduous in attempting to enlist senior leadership from PAHO to be with us today, and there was great interest on their part to be here today. But the director, the deputy director, the head of external and international affairs, and the head of the person who heads up the work on NCDs, all were unable to make it. And so we tried valiantly, but this is a tough time of year in their calendars. And I think it is regrettable that, that they weren't with us, because they bring enormous aptitude, and they're terribly important in multiple ways, and we all benefit from them. I think we were lucky to have John Andrus with us today, as former deputy director. And there are probably some other people here in the room that I apologize, I'm forgetting, have had long-standing relations with PAHO. Charles, maybe as the career Latin Americanist, what would you say to the question? That
I mean, my view of, I mean, first of all, if you do not know, PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, is the regional sub-body of the World Health Organization. They don't have a great deal of money. They don't tell countries what to do. They collaborate with countries. And so their ability to influence has got a lot to do with their winning personality and the validity of their arguments. And so they do a great job giving the constraints that they face, but they face huge constraints and small budgets.
Yeah, and you know, PAHO, it's interesting because they do have a slightly different history than other parts, regional entities of WHO. They were not created from WHO like the other regions. They were actually created, preceded WHO. And so they've always functioned a little bit more independently. But to your point, you know, I think if you look at the WHO system, the World Health Organization system in general, you know, this is a time where because of budgets, because of lack of, in some ways, I think, lack of confidence in WHO's ability to continue to fulfill a lot of its functions, and which came first, chicken or the egg? Is it because of lack of resources, et cetera? I think they don't play the role that they have in the past. That said, we need those sorts of regional bodies because they are able to look across the whole region. They are able to set standards. They are able to develop capacity. There's a huge need for PAHO to be strong, and I think in this day and age, thinking about what's the shifting role at a point in time when corporations are doing more, the private sector is doing more, capacity at the country level is greater than it was back in the early 1900s when, you know, the Pan American Sanitation Organization, or whatever it was called back then, was created. So I think the biggest challenge is, how does PAHO continue to shift and be relevant in today's world? But I think the need for a PAHO is still as strong as ever.
I'll just add a couple points to that. I mean, we've just had the elimination of rubella in the region. PAHO played a key role there. We heard Senator Isaacson's statement around the role played in polio and measles elimination in the Americas, which was a first. So it has a very distinguished history. It goes back to 1902 as the Sanitary Commission. It's still very active on immunization programs that reach children that are remote and underprivileged and those that are facing the greatest inequities and marginalization. And the revolving fund is quite important that PAHO's created, and the collaborations with the Gavi Alliance, the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. So it has done some things that are complicated and quite innovative and fundamental to being able to continue to address those pockets of deep inequity and marginality within and poverty within Latin America. PAHO still plays a very important role.
Good. You had a question?
I'm glad you mentioned PAHO. I was thinking about it through the whole meeting. It's a very important organization. From my experience in healthcare or medicine, one of the reasons is because it's respected amongst ministries of health in the area, in Latin America, and in the Caribbean. And further, they have a tremendous database, not only historically, but modern times. And also, in conclusion, women play a very significant role in the empowerment of the organization. I believe that a woman is now director.
Correct.
And they operate very strongly from the Caribbean island of Jamaica.
Right.
Thank you. I don't see anyone there. There is one other topic that was, okay, I'll come. Please, why don't you all, I'll keep my question for later.
No trouble, thank you. My name is Juan Leon from Emory. Public health is changing so fast in Latin America and the Caribbean, and public health professionals and NGOs and the ministries, et cetera, need to have good training to respond to all these new changes and emergencies. In your opinions, what is the role of U.S. public health universities, such as Georgia State or an Emory or Johns Hopkins, et cetera, to help train these Latin American professionals, if at all?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I think the role of universities continues to be very important in global health, broadly speaking. And, you know, I think it has changed a lot. I think there was a time, you know, not only for the Americas, but whether it's Africa, Asia, or Middle East, where, you know, the capacity was so low in so many of the places that there was just a need for people who could implement, who could actually deliver programs. You know, we're clearly not in that day any longer. And I think thinking now much more about how are we having exchange of information, because I think there's a lot that we can also learn from the work in the Americas and in global health in general. And I think one of the things that I think is particularly exciting is that as we really start to think about global health, including the United States, which is part of the globe after all, and start thinking about what are the lessons that we can learn. So yes, I mean, universities, American universities, hugely important for helping to train and build capacity of people in the Americas and around the world. I think we could also benefit from going to some of the universities in other parts of the world who would have things to teach us as well. So I really do think that we're moving into an era where we ought to be thinking about global health truly in the sense of global, and how are we sharing and learning from each other while we still think about, you know, looking at building those kind of capacity needs that still do exist around the world.
I think it's important to emphasize that the many key Latin leaders on public health, pioneers, are shaping American education. I mean, Julio Frank has been the dean at the Harvard School of Public Health, is now going on to be president of the University of Miami. Steph Bertozzi is the dean of the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. There are other instances in which those that have had profound impact in innovating and leading are here embedded within our premier institutions and really having enormous impact. And that creates both a pull and a push factor, and it facilitates the kind of partnerships and cross-collaborations that are very needed. And I think it's important to emphasize that historically, you go look at Tulane, you look at some of these other institutions, they've had a couple generations of these kinds of very deep relationships. The Consortium of Universities of Global Health was formed 7 years ago, I believe it is now. It has over 200 member institutions. It's a very strong representation from within the Caribbean and Latin America within the Consortium of Universities of Global Health. And when you go to the annual meetings, the most recent was end of March in Boston, very strong representation in the panels, in the moderation, in the plenaries, and in the like. And I think that's all terrific.
The other topic that wasn't mentioned really was HIV/AIDS. Could you give a quick comment on the status of HIV/AIDS from Mexico down to Argentina through Brazil? Not to mention the Caribbean.
In 30 seconds.
I mean, it was such a major topic for so many years. It surely still is.
Yeah, it is. Well, you know, I think, again, has been one of the themes across all of this is that if you talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, there is no one Latin America and the Caribbean. It's many, many different countries. And, you know, a small island nation that has any HIV has a whole different risk than a large country that might have, you know, higher prevalence, but, you know, a larger population. So, you know, I think it really does span the spectrum. I think one of the things when I think about HIV and the Americas is the real pioneering role that some of the countries, Brazil, for instance, which was one of the very first countries that made a commitment to treatment of people living with HIV in a way that really turned the tide, I think, for drug prices, for the belief that, in fact,
President
right,
Cardoso.
for, you know, for the equity issues that were involved in it, the way that they took on prevention in a very straightforward way around drugs as well as same-sex relationships. So, you know, I think Mexico, again, another country that didn't have a huge HIV problem, and if you looked at the prevalence rates, but took it on and said, as part of our commitment to equitable health, providing drugs to people with HIV was a commitment that they made very early on. So I think, you know, Latin America has shown a lot of very visionary leadership around that. On the other, you know, we have some of the work in Haiti that Paul Farmer and Partners in Health pioneered around, you know, ways in which even in a poor country, treatment could be given using kind of these community health workers as ways. So I think there's lots of different models in the Americas that show the range of ways in which HIV, in fact, can be treated. And then we have the Cuban model, which was, of course, very interesting, that started out with a model that, you know, a lot of the soldiers returning from high prevalence countries in Africa actually got quarantined. And yes, if you quarantine and put a ring fence around for a while, you can control the epidemic. I think they quickly realized that, you know, you really can't use that sort of containment for HIV, and they changed continued to change their approach as well. So, you know, lots of different models that I think fit the very different ways in which HIV was evolved in the different countries, as well as the different sizes of those nations. I will say one of the things that I think is very disappointing and continues to be a real challenge is the status, particularly of gay men in the Caribbean who face incredible discrimination, and I think it has driven people underground and has made the situation worse in many parts of the Caribbean, where to be gay is to be stoned to death and greatly stigmatized. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and, you know, it's not only there, but you know, I think some of the most stark examples have been in some of the countries there, and I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the area of stigma and discrimination.
I think we can end on a very positive note, actually.
And I don't know if you have anything more to say about it.
I think you've exhausted. I think you've hit it all.
Yes, I think you have really.
Great.
That's been quite wonderful. I'm going to actually conclude our session at this point, and I'm going to stand because it makes it a little easier for me. But, you know, our objective in bringing the summit to Atlanta has been, this is over the past 4 years, to bring together leading global health organizations in Atlanta, their expertise, their knowledge, and also their organizational ability, their ability to deliver health care to where it's needed. And with between 300 to 400 registrants each time over these years, I really think we've achieved that in a very successful way, thanks to our partnerships here. I hope that you've really been enriched by what you've heard and you've learned today, and by the contacts you've made, because in the end, success is based on collaboration. And I think that if we can engender any collaboration amongst the dozens of organizations that are represented in the audience, outside, and of course we've had them on the platform as well, that would be a huge success. We're truly indebted to our visionary sponsors, the Coca-Cola Company and UPS, for financially supporting this effort over the years. And I say visionary because they bought into it and they bought into the idea of what we've tried to do. But of course, as well, the Robinson College of Business, this year, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, that's playing an increasing role in the community, as well as, of course, the taking off and landing point for us all, and the CDC Foundation, which does amazing work in raising money that can't be raised from the government sources for CDC, particularly the Ebola crisis. They played a major role in helping through the Gates Foundation and others with that. But I have to mention right at the top of the list the leadership and intellectual leadership, as well as actual support, financial support from CSIS and from Steve Morrison. Steve, you've been absolutely stupendous in bringing together the concepts and the people to make these summits possible. And of course, our own Helene Gale, you'll be missed in Atlanta, but you'll be back on these platforms, I know that. It's been just a great honor for us to work with both of you, and as we've tried to craft and build these programs. Finally, I need to, I don't know if she's here, thank our program manager, Mish Spink, who's worked tirelessly to make this all happen. It's actually quite an accomplishment, even though we've got a little echo on the stage, to put all this together. It's live streamed. It'll be seen in DC, CSIS, the State Department is streaming it, and others. So this is a major technical accomplishment, quite aside from having, I think, had a fairly flawless registration process for you all. So thank you to Mish, to Henna Koski, who's worked closely with her, our interns, and especially our volunteers. There are a whole group of volunteers who've come back 2 or 3 years running, so they're devils for punishment, and we thank them. We couldn't do it without them. I do have to mention that sadly Mish will be leaving us for California, so it's actually the last time that she'll be doing this program. I wanted to give her a round of applause, and I told her to be here, but she's not. Maybe she is. Mish, where are you? Please come up. Please come forward. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll miss you greatly. At the same time, we'll breathe a little less easily without you there, but we appreciate it all. For those of you that are not members of the World Affairs Council, we've already had a commercial from Helene Gale, who's on our board, and from Charles, our leader as president. And I have to say, Charles, thank you. You've really made a huge contribution to this program, and we partially picked Latin America because we knew you were coming on board to join us, and it really paid off wonderfully. So hopefully we can continue to offer these programs if you all become members. Thank you very much, and do stay and network with each other and exchange cards, and hopefully see you next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.